Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new Masterclass webinar series for 2022. If you didn't get a chance to tune in last month, my name is Anna Ruiz. I'm a Senior Technical Marketing Architect, and I will be your host today. So many of you may know me from last year's TechZone Live quarterly webinar event. And before we dive into our topic today, I wanted to make a few announcements. I made these announcements last month, so bear with me if you joined us last month, but just for anyone new joining us today. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with our long-running networking masterclass series that focused on sharing the latest innovations and capabilities of our application delivery and security product. And this year, we actually decided to join forces. So we've combined TechZone Live with our networking masterclass series. So therefore, we have expanded the masterclass series to include topics that cover our entire Citrix portfolio. Our masterclass series will run monthly, and each session will last approximately 45 to 60 minutes. We have a lot of awesome content and great speakers lined up for the remainder of the year, so make sure to tune into our upcoming masterclasses. Just as a quick reminder, we are going to be recording this session, and we'll be sending a link after the event. And you're able to submit questions via the Q&A tab, which we'll either be answering live or via chat. So let's get started. For our second masterclass of the year, we're going to be talking about how to deploy Citrix ADC. And we understand how important it is for IT leaders to have quick turnaround when using modern infrastructure. So you want to get your ADCs up and running and not make any mistakes that would cause your deployment to be delayed. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we're actually going to take a look at some of the most common deployment errors. This way, you can avoid making them yourself. And we're going to showcase where you can find deployment best practices and how automation can handle a lot of the heavy lifting. Today, I'm very excited to welcome not only one, but two experts to our masterclass. So Andrew Scott, he's an application delivery and security sales engineer manager, and Stephen Wright, a senior solutions architect for Citrix ADC. So Andrew, Stephen, welcome to our masterclass. I'm super excited to see what you've prepared for us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. So my name's Andrew Scott, and I'm joined, as Anna said, by Stephen, a long-time colleague. In terms of the agenda, what the plan is for today is take a look at what the common challenges that we've both seen in sort of production deployments, do a bit of a walkthrough in a standard deployment and the licensing, and then applying some base configuration settings, and then kind of moving on to a production service of some sort. And then we've got some recommended reading that provides some background on the things that we talk about today. And I think the first things first, though, it's really talking about what are the common challenges that we've seen when we do deployments. And I think, Stephen, when we've talked about these, they really come down just to a short list, isn't it, pretty much, in terms of what we've both seen.
Yes, we tend to see the same things time in and time out on deployments, and these are common challenges which come up time and time again. It's not uncommon to find customers who've connected networks to the ADC without completing a VLAN configuration. They have various networks connected. Initially, everything appears to work. However, very often they don't have any redundancy. They'll have connected one interface to one network, one interface to another network, and perhaps a third interface off to their management network. There's no redundancy there at all. A single cable could take down the environment. Secondly, very often the customers don't set up any isolation of subnets inside of those environments. So they put these devices in, they connect them to the various networks, but they have them all configured in their native VLAN, which is VLAN 1. By default, Citrix ADC runs every IP address on every interface, and it does that because all of the interfaces by default are inside of VLAN 1. So often the customer will take the appliance, they will connect up the various interfaces to their various networks. They will put the IP addresses onto their ADC, and they will have the appearance to all the world that it runs absolutely beautifully. But what perhaps they don't realize is that if I was connected to a device in the untrusted network, and I were to set a secondary IP address on some other server sitting in untrusted, potentially I could talk to IP addresses that they'd intended to be within the trusted network running on the ADC. Worse, if I've connected the same network to multiple interfaces, I'm likely to see performance issues, an inability to establish connections, random disconnected sessions, in severe situations, network disruption, seemingly unrelated to the ADC itself. The ADC may also report MAC address moves, muted interfaces, or management interface transmit and receive buffer overflows, depending on the exact nature of the interaction with the network.
I think the other point I saw from when I was looking at this slide, as you were kind of talking through that, I think the other thing that you kind of touched on was that the differentiation between data and management interfaces, because the main ports are actually fully rated for the full throughput of the appliance, where some of those management interfaces, they're just designed for management traffic. So that could be another consideration. So if I move it on.
I think it's an excellent point. We do have lots of customers who make the assumption that the management interface will simply carry management traffic. By default, that isn't the case, and that very much touches on what we're saying here. Thankfully, the solution's quite straightforward. So what should you do? Well, what you should do is you should take one or more interfaces, and you would configure them on your ADC and on your switch side to be in an LACP pair. And in an LACP pair, you would have a link aggregation channel, here diagrammed as LA1. Now, LA1 is comprising interfaces 1.1 and 1.2, which of course means that if 1.1 were to fail, then the business would continue operating over 1.2. We've removed those single points of failure. You might set the native VLAN to 1, but then you would take tagged VLANs in addition to the native, and now we could have 3 separate VLANs going for our 3 separate networks. And critically, what we've done here is we've moved away from having a single VLAN 1 carrying all of the subnets, and now we have 3 separate VLANs, each carrying their respective subnets.
So I guess it's all about MBF and PBR. You got to have some 3-lettered acronyms, haven't you?
You certainly have, and they're very misunderstood 3-letter acronyms. So I guess the first thing to say is that Citrix ADC has got one routing table, and it's one routing table across all of the interfaces. It's not one routing table per interface, as many people seem to mistakenly configure. So you've got one routing table. The diagram, which I've quickly thrown together here to highlight this, is quite a common deployment style. And the routing table, which is on the right, is what I'd expect if we were to ignore the client laptop, which is hitting the NSIP. So what I'd be expecting here in an environment with an internet, a trusted network, and a management network, is I'd expect the routing table to say the default gateway was via the internet router. I'd expect the trusted network to have routes connecting to whatever your internal IP ranges might be, and I'd expect the management network to have some IP addresses on there which were sitting in the management subnet. Quite nice and straightforward. Now, that's a very common deployment. But if we consider for a second how that laptop we're going to connect, what you'll find is that the laptop, let's say the laptop is sitting on 10.1.1.2 on the trusted network. If that laptop accesses the NSIP, the management IP, it's going to be routed over your internal network via your normal routing tables, which will take it onto the management network. So the trusted network is connecting to the management network. Nice and straightforward. When we get the reply traffic, however, the ADC will look in that singular routing table, and it will see that the best way to connect back to the trusted network and to send that reply traffic is to send the traffic not via 10.2.2.1, the management network router, but instead to send that traffic back via the trusted network router on 10.1.1.1. The impact of this, of course, is that we now have asymmetric routing. That's not necessarily an issue. It will work in most environments. But it's those last caveats of it will work and in most environments which can trip us up quite a lot. If I introduced firewalls and those firewalls needed to be able to allow certain types of traffic, I would now have to put rules on 2 separate firewalls, one in the trusted network and one for the management network. potentially those firewalls still wouldn't work if they were stateful firewalls and they were looking for the reply traffic coming back. At best, that's going to be quite confusing. Now, if it doesn't work, what a lot of customers will do, in my opinion incorrectly, to fix this problem, is to turn on something called MAC-based forwarding. MAC-based forwarding, or MBF, again, in my opinion, completely the wrong solution, will cause the ADC not to reply using its routing table, but instead to send replies back to whichever router spoke to the ADC. It also poses the problem that traffic which is initiated from the laptop will reply back to the management router, but traffic which is initiated from the ADC will not be reply traffic, and that will connect via the management laptop via a different router. So the inbound and outbound reply traffic are now taking different paths. So if we wouldn't use MAC-based forwarding, what would we use? And the answer would be policy-based routing. Policy-based routing lets us do something remarkably similar. And it's remarkably similar in so much as we could create a policy-based route which said reply traffic for the NSIP, or traffic simply sourced from the NSIP, will connect to the management router if it's going outside of the management network. That's far more granular. It's far easier to understand. That, I think, brings us to a final question on this. What is MAC-based forwarding for? If MAC-based forwarding is always bad, Stephen, why is it there? What should it be used for? Well, let's imagine a scenario where that I had multiple internet gateways. I've got a connection from ISP1 and a connection from ISP2, and users are coming in and hitting my business service from both of those two internet connections. I couldn't possibly define a routing table that said everything on the internet is via ISP1, but it's also via ISP2. What I would want to say is that people who arrive on ISP1 go back out of the router for ISP1, and people who arrive on ISP2 do the same. And that's a wonderful use case for MAC-based forwarding.
Okay. So I was just looking at your diagram, and I think it's got a natural two-arm configuration with a kind of side branch management network. I take it your recommendations still stand for a single-arm deployed appliance?
The recommended deployment model, I put my consulting hat back on for a second. The recommended deployment model is going to come down to whatever the customer wants to do. Citrix ADC will support a two-arm style model, which is what you see here, but it will also support a one-arm style model where the ADC lives behind a firewall and all of the traffic is routed in and out of that firewall. Both would be absolutely acceptable. The question would be, what's normal in your environment?
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I think we'll move it on to the third challenge, which we kind of rattled through. So we covered off the kind of connectivity one and then the routing one, and then this is more of a feature-based thing. And I think one of the challenges potentially around this one is there's some standard settings that get inherited when you've got an appliance that's already been deployed. And then there's the standards that you get with the modern appliance that you might deploy today. So there's kind of differences there. And this, again, comes back to that IP forwarding question I think you've got circled on the diagram.
The thrust of what I'm saying here is that the modes and features in your environment may well differ from the default modes and features that Citrix ADC is shipped with. For a long time, Citrix ADC was shipped with Layer 3 mode enabled by default. I'm pretty sure that it's disabled in modern firmware. However, Layer 3 mode is not the ability for the ADC to take part in a Layer 3 network, but is in fact telling the ADC to function as a router. It's telling it to do IP forwarding as if it were a router. So imagine, if you will, that you've connected the internet, or maybe a DMZ, a trusted network, and a management network. You would not expect a device which is sitting in that DMZ network to be able to set the ADC as its next hop, as its gateway to get to the management or the trusted network, and for the ADC to start forwarding those packets. But with Layer 3 mode turned on, it will do exactly that. So there are a number of default modes and features, and The one which I would most commonly call out, because the ADC is regularly deployed as a secure demarcation point between non-trusted and trusted environments, is to ensure layer 3 mode is turned off, which again, it is in modern firmware releases, but it's quite common when I go and assess people's environments that it's still switched on from older config. So layer 3 mode disabled because it will allow packet forwarding. But in addition to that, disabling all of the modes and the features which aren't specifically needed within your environment.
Yeah, I think that's just good practice, isn't it? Because if you don't need certain things, then it makes sense to turn them off. Otherwise, you're potentially opening yourself up.
100%. And I guess the follow-on question to that is, well, if we had an expert, if we had somebody who does this day to day, what would they turn on and off in a generic environment? And we're going to cover that shortly.
Okay, cool. Right, so we have a bit of a walkthrough. So this is the kind of setup we're going to use. We're going to make use of something called Application Delivery Manager as our kind of management console for doing this deployment. We're going to use the cloud service version of it. There is an on-prem one, but the cloud service has a few more features, and that's why we need this ADM agent involved in the equation. And it's kind of laid out very architecturally as the diagram suggests. And we've got a kind of a default setup. So fundamentally, this is your lab, isn't it, Steve?
It is indeed. This is my lab environment, which for reasons of noise, I run on a Mac Mini. They're a wonderful device for a lab environment because they make almost no noise, and you can hide them around the house like media centers without annoying people with loud servers in the cupboard. So enough about my lab. I'm going to start by pretending to log into citrix.com and download the latest version of firmware for Citrix ADC. I say pretending because what you're going to observe me do in a second is to click on the 13.1, the latest release of the virtual appliance. And once I've clicked on that, and I go on to download, and I'm using VMware Fusion here, but I'm going to be downloading the ESX image. And when I click on this, I don't want to bore you all to death by sitting waiting for my download. So here is a download I prepared earlier, which is why I'm pretending. Now I'm unzipping the file there. Once the file's unzipped, we should find an OVF file, which I can double click on. I'm going to import that OVF. Thankfully, my Mac Mini is blessed with solid state storage, so this should be reasonably fast. Let's just wait for that to import. We're going to customize the settings. I'm going to give this device 4 gigabytes of memory, and I'm then going to connect it to my Ethernet network. And we'll go ahead and import a second node. The reason I'm importing a second node is that when I run through the demos in a few minutes, I'm going to create an HA pair because that's absolutely what I would expect you to be using in a business scenario. Just wait for that to import. Go ahead and give that 4 gigabytes of RAM again, then set it to Ethernet, and then we should be ready to power on both of those two instances. Now these instances are, again, the ESXi images. They're exactly the sort of images that I would expect you to be importing in your scenario. Those images are going to be able to talk to Citrix Cloud by virtue of using an agent. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is to connect up to adm.cloud.com, which, my browser's gone wrong. Let's just close the browser and reopen it. I'm going to connect up to adm.cloud.com here. If my browser works, I am. Anyway, there we go. Connect up to admcloud.com. I'm going to authenticate and log into the environment. I've used this before, but I have cleared down my ADM environment pretty much back to blank. So you should see pretty much the same thing when you log in. I say pretty much. The only exception to that is you can set different profiles for passwords on the ADC. I haven't cleared those. So I've logged into ADM. We'll switch back to the ADCs, and we'll go and assign some IP addresses to the ADCs. This is something I would expect maybe the network team to be doing, hey, please can you boot me up these ADCs, give them some base IPs, which we've done there. They'll now reboot. And please can you also install for me the ADM agent. Now, as I said, I logged into adm.cloud.com. I want to set up the agent. We're going to tell it we're doing a custom deployment. We're going to tell it that we're doing an on-premises deployment, and it's a traditional on-premises deployment. As I move forward here, we should get a drop-down, which, again, I'm going to fib and say, hey, I'm going to download these files. I did this earlier. We're going to select the ESXi files. And if I hop over, I should be able to see the agent file, which, again, is exactly what you would have got if you sat and waited for that to download. I'm going to decompress that file, and I'm going to open up the OVF for that file as well. So again, we go through, we import this. Let's wait for this to import, and we shall set.
I suppose you're just doing one agent in this case.
Pardon?
You're just doing one agent in this case.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just doing the one agent, but I'm only doing one agent because I don't want to bore people with waiting for it. Now, you may have seen the ADM web page a second ago, which is telling you the minimum amount of RAM on an ADM agent is 32 gigabytes. Now, I haven't set my environment to 32 gigabytes. I haven't done that simply because my lab is fairly limited. But that would be the minimum for production deployment. So we'll just wait while that ADM agent boots up. And as we're waiting, I'm going to log into my ADCs, and I'm going to go and set a non-default password. You probably don't need to do this at this stage, but I'm slightly paranoid. I don't like leaving anything on default passwords. So there's my ADCs booted up. Non-default password set on both of the two. ADM agent has been downloaded. The ADM agent hopefully will be ready in a second or two. Takes a long time when you're sitting waiting for this to happen. It's only been a few seconds, I should add. It just feels like a long time when you're watching it. Now, you can probably note in the web page in the background that I am literally following the eDocs to do this. I'm going to put an IP address in here. I'm going to go and set a subnet. I'm going to set a DNS server. I'm going to set a gateway. That's basically it. Once I've done that, save and exit. Now, I've done that. I've done the save and exit. What do I need to do now? I need to log in, and I need to run the deployment_type.py command. Now, what that command is doing is, maybe I'd be better off doing this with SSH. What that command is going to do is it's going to connect us up to the admcloud.com service. And you're possibly wondering why I'm doing it with SSH rather than doing it in the browser window. Browser? That's the wrong word. Why I'm doing it in the VMware Fusion window. And the reason for that is that my VMware Fusion console doesn't like copy and paste. So I'm going to SSH in, but I'm going to run the exact same command once I get in there. I just don't want to have to sit and type in each of those strings. So I've run the deployment type script. I'm going to now feed in those service URL and activation code, and then I'm going to feed in a new password for my ADM agent, and we're going to wait a little while the ADM agent service goes off, registers, and starts working with the cloud platform.
Yeah, it is a lot easier to copy than paste with PuTTY. As I think typing the activation code can be, the URL to register ADM is not too bad, but the activation code is a bit more challenging, that's for sure.
Oh, very much so. The very idea of putting that into Notepad and sitting and reading and typing every single character into the console is not a thought I relish. So SSH and copy and paste works extremely well for this. Now, as I said, this is connecting up to our admcloud.com service. I should really wait until it's started the agent, but I'm quite impatient, and you can see that I've already pressed the button to move forward. The agent has not gone green. It will go green when it's ready. That's purely my impatience. You can see that it's orange there. So we'll give a few more seconds. Now, once the agent is ready, I can specify the agent, which is, of course, the agent I've just imported. You've just watched me set up. And I can go and specify the ADCs, which I want the agent to connect me to. Let's just wait until that agent is up and running. There we are. Now, I said earlier that I had cleared down my ADM service environment, mostly. And this is the piece I didn't clear. I have a different named profile from the default. But what I'm doing is exactly the same as you would do with the default. I'm setting a username and a password by which the ADM service will connect and access those ADCs. It doesn't matter what the profile is called. You need a profile, and in that profile, which is assigned to the ADCs, you're specifying a username, password, credentials for ADM service to be able to connect via the ADM agent to those ADCs. You can see I'm still being quite impatient here and trying to move on before the agent is ready. Of course, in a normal environment, you would have said, please boot me these ADCs, nice friendly network team, please boot me these agents, and you would not be trying to do this in under 5 minutes. So you would not be clicking the forward and backwards buttons while you were waiting for it to become ready.
Ooh, got some green ticks.
There we go. My agent is now ready, and it has connected to the ADCs, and it will now go through and import those ADCs into ADM service. And if I hit finish on here, then happily my ADCs are now available and talking to ADM service. And again, little bit of delay while we wait for the agent to get up and running, but this is a, I think, 4.5 minute demo, and I think in a normal environment, you wouldn't be trying to do this in 4.5 minutes. So we've got our ADCs
so, Stephen,
imported.
Before you move on real quick, so I know before you showed the demo, you talked about that there's also an on-premises based solution for the ADM service. So can you just briefly talk about, either you or Andrew, some of those differences between the ADM service that is cloud hosted and the on-premises based solution?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the main difference is when Stephen dropped the agent into his test environment, you didn't see him have to set anything up for that. You just needed to ensure that he had, I think he used Google DNS on the configuration of the agent, and it does an out call 443 to just get connectivity to ADM service in the cloud. If you're using on-prem deployed version of ADM, one of the things that you need to do is, if you don't have WAN connectivity between the remote DC and where you've installed ADM on-prem, you need to actually open up some ports, actually quite a lot of ports, to get connectivity. So there's a sort of base connectivity requirement in the first instance. The other thing that the ADM service has, which we probably touch on much later in this presentation, is that it's got some things built on top of it. It uses artificial intelligence and some machine learning technologies. So it means that there's some benefits from the cloud which you don't really get on premise. So that, plus some options to do some quite slick automation, which things like auto scaling, they're all things that you get with the cloud version of ADM. In terms of our sort of direction, we're tending at the moment, there's just a few things that the on-prem version doesn't have, but the goal going forward is that there'll be more push for more development within the cloud version of ADM as a kind of standard, because it's able to be much more agile than the on-prem version of it. So that's the kind of key differences ultimately.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Well, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you. So we move on to licensing. Andrew, do you want to tell us all about licensing?
Yeah, so obviously Stephen's going with the ADM service. So we're using ADM in combination with something called pooled capacity. And there's a couple of different ways in which you can kind of use licensing. And if you sort of look back historically at how ADCs have always been licensed, they've always been geared up around a certain amount of throughput. So you come to talk to a customer, and one of the first questions that you try and understand from the customer is that what's their demand for throughput? And it was always quite a technical question. It was quite a challenging one because a lot of the times customers didn't have a good idea on what they really needed. So one of the things that we introduced a few years ago was this concept of a pool of capacity. So rather than it being assigned to a physical appliance, you have a subscription of capacity which exists on the ADM management platform. And that gives you a number of benefits. Fundamentally, it means, as the diagram shows, you can have different pools with different capabilities. So standard, enterprise, and platinum are our kind of feature bundles. You can also have a pool of instances, and you can then dynamically allocate capacity wherever it is you need it within your data center. I think within Stephen's data center, he's obviously got quite a small environment, but we can allocate capacity to those instances. And then if Stephen needs more capacity, he just calls it off from ADM and just assigns it to the instances. So this gives you some options in terms of what you can do with ADCs that you didn't really have before. So the option to do things like dynamic allocation based on demands. And the other thing that's really nice is the fact that once you've assigned pooled capacity to an appliance, you're not stuck with the types of appliance that Citrix sells. So if you want a 15.5 gig throughput appliance, and you just call off that capacity from the pool. So it gives you a lot more capacity flexibility within the sort of usage case of an ADC. And also when you change allocation, there isn't any kind of restart. So it's seamless and dynamic allocation on demand. So it's a really nice capability. There's a lot of benefits in a lot of ways. And one of the things about the pandemic was that we had a lot of customers demanding a lot more capacity for certain appliances, and using pool capacity, they could flex that capacity as they needed to. So I think you've got a bit of a walkthrough to just sort of go through and actually set these up.
So we're going to select our imported ADCs. We are going to click licensing, and we're going to elect to use pooled licensing. And then we're going to go ahead and assign 2 gigabit per second of pooled bandwidth to each of the 2 ADCs. And you can see there that the ADC is going to restart as we've changed the amount of bandwidth allocated to it. Let's assign licensing to the second ADC, which again, pooled license, 2 gigabit. And as simple as that, we have now assigned an amount of licensing, which of course we could come back later, change, reallocate, move around our environment if we needed to. What you will be able to see is the amount of licenses from the pool which you have allocated as a whole, simply by going into the pooled licensing dashboard and viewing the amount of licenses allocated.
So here we go. We're going to assign these 2 nodes using a configuration job to create an HA pair. So we've actually got a working license pair of units. So this one's logged into, it says 2 gig, which we assigned within the infrastructure. And we're going to go down and look at a config job to drop these 2 nodes into an HA pair. So we need to give it a name for the task, define which node's going to be the primary, and pick which node's going to be the secondary. There's an option there to choose ink mode, but we're not going to do that in this case. We can schedule it or run it now, and we're just going to run it now because we want to get this job done. So that completes really quickly. So we've got our pair defined, and Now it changes the entry in ADM to be an HA entry, so 10 and 11 are paired up as HA nodes. And just going to try and pull up one of the instances, the primary instance. So if we go into 10 now, we should have, this is the configuration on the primary. So this is the primary node. Go into system and nodes, and we can see that 10 is the primary, 11 is the secondary, and it's up and running as a pair. So that's our HA pair configured. Again, we used a configuration job just to try and sort of move things along. So what about base configuration then, Stephen? I suppose we've imported those two instances. We've licensed them using pool capacity. We've set up the base HA setup. So now when we drop configuration onto the primary, it'll be replicated onto the secondary. Now I guess we need to pull some best practice and put them onto these particular production units that we're ready to deploy.
I think there's a huge amount of value in understanding every setting on your ADC, because options that are right for a generic implementation might not meet your needs. You might not want a generic ADC. You might want something that's generic but tweaked to fit a certain use case. The best practices for Citrix ADC deployments article that we've linked at the top of this slide is focused on a generic implementation, but it's 15 pages long, and as it's my article, I hope I've done a fairly good job of explaining what every setting is and why I recommend the settings that I recommend in it. Now, there will be those who've already read the article and just want to implement the recommended settings. You can do that by copying and pasting each command into Notepad and running them on the ADC. Thankfully, there's a much more enterprise way of running commands on ADCs, which is called ADM Services Configuration Jobs. Now, as a side note, if you'd prefer not to use ADM Service Configuration Jobs, which we'll hear more on in a moment, you can alternatively use third-party automation tools like Ansible. You can also use a third-party system to trigger commands in ADM Service if you prefer to integrate the two. Now, a configuration job will let you define a set of commands, make some of those parameters for the commands into variables, and run the commands against selected ADCs. You could, for example, make a template of all the best practice commands within my article and just run that template set of commands on all new ADCs as and when you build them. At this point, you'll be noticing my second link, which is a set of pre-built configuration commands, so you don't need to make your own, and you can simply use the ones in the article. So let's use the pre-built configuration job, which again is going to run each of the commands that I recommend in the best practice article at the top of the screen, which you should absolutely read because I explain each of the commands and you may not want a generic implementation. So the very first thing we need to do, of course, is to go and download those commands. You saw the link on the previous screen. There are some prerequisites here. If I move down the prerequisites list, you can see we're disabling physical interfaces which aren't used. We're marking interfaces which are in link aggregates as unmonitored because we don't want to fail over if an individual component interface fails. I'm not going to read each of these prerequisites, but there are some clear specifics we need to do. And in a virtual environment, those specifics broadly are to have a management SSL certificate, to have a management SSL certificate, and also to have a SNP, an outbound IP address configured on the ADC HA pair for it to make outbound connections. So what I'm doing now is connecting to my ADC HA pair. I have created a SNP, which you can see my interface list looks good. My VLANs look good because I have only one subnet and only one VLAN. Of course, you'll remember us covering that earlier on. I've got my my outbound SNP here, and the next thing that I'm going to need is I'm going to need that Yeah, there's the SNP, there's the routes. I'm going to need the SSL certificate to use for management purposes, which I will create in a moment. There's our routing table. Again, that's quite straightforward and good. Moving on down. Here I'm talking about disabling MAC-based forwarding, which I could do simply by, here I'm talking about turning off layer 3 mode, which I could do simply by disabling it here. I'm not going to change the modes and features here. We're going to do those in the configuration job. Now, if we go into traffic management and SSL, we have the option to create a self-signed certificate. You should absolutely not create a self-signed certificate. You should use a trusted certificate, which is going to be trusted by your servers and by your client computers when they connect to the ADC, and when they hit it for management purposes, you won't receive any error messages because it'll be signed by an internal certification authority which your devices absolutely trust. So why am I doing this? Because for the purposes of this demo, I don't want to go and build a full certification environment to create SSL certificates, so I'm just going to create a self-signed SSL certificate, which is exactly what I've done there. I've got this self-signed certificate running on the ADC, and I will be able to reference it later. I will now download the 2 configuration jobs. One of those configuration jobs is called primary, and one of those configuration jobs is called secondary. Both of them are JSON files. We'll download both of those. Got those there. Let's go back onto our ADM service environment. Now, within ADM service, I can go into configuration jobs. So inside of configuration jobs, I can go and elect to import the template. Which I can do simply by clicking on import and then selecting the JSON file which we previously downloaded. So there is one of those files now imported. That file again has all of the various best practice settings from the article at the top. If I scroll through the article quite quickly, you can see a large number of commands which are in those command blocks you could have copied and pasted, and I compare the two, and yes, you can see that the commands are indeed exactly the same. Now, what you'll be noticing on here is that many of the parameters for the commands are listed in green. The reason those are listed in green is because those are input variables. So we are importing, yes, all of the commands, but we're importing them with some input blocks, which we are going to be able to fill in a few minutes. So that's both of those 2 templates imported. We've got a template for primary and a template for secondary. And we're now in a position where we could create configuration jobs using them. Let's go ahead and create a configuration job to apply the best practice settings to the primary node. We'll give it a name, and let's drag and drop in all of our best practice base config settings and hit next in here. When we hit next, we're going to select the HA pair that we want to run this against. You can see that by default, there's a tick box on execute on the primary node. And on the next screen, we are going to be able to fill in all of the variables that we want to complete the commands. You will note that there is a radio button on the screen which will allow us to import these values from a CSV file. So if I wasn't setting up 1 HA pair, but instead I was setting up 50 HA pairs, then I could very easily import all of these values from a CSV file. And of course, I would then be able to configure the entire environment across the entire globe, connecting through my many ADM agents to my various different data centers, wherever they might be. I'll go ahead and fill the rest of these values in. These, I hope you will agree, are reasonably straightforward questions. I will then get a resultant set of commands which are to be executed on all of the ADCs. Of course, in my case, it's one HA pair. I could choose, I'm not going to, but I could choose to execute this at some future time and date. Perhaps I have a change control window which opens up for this next Saturday, so I schedule the job for next Saturday and simply come in and watch it run. But in my case, I'm going to execute that job now. The ADM service will connect using ADM Agent to the HA pair, and then it will execute each command within that configuration job. And then I will get an answer back in a second telling me what did and did not execute. So we see that's complete, which of course means every single command has executed. And if I go into the configuration job itself, I can then open up and I can see all of the various commands which have been run in there. And of course I can do this past tense if somebody's asked me what I ran on that system last week. And I know that everything has run exactly as I would want it to. So that's my primary node fully configured with all of the best practice settings. Let's go and create another configuration job now, and we'll import the singular best practice setting for the secondary node. Of course, all of those settings executed in the primary execute in the secondary too. There's simply one command I normally recommend which doesn't carry across in HA, and we need to go and run that now. We again specify which devices to run it on, but we tick the radio button this time to execute on the secondary node. Again, we're going to run this now. It's in progress. We should get this back in a second. And again, the command has now completed, and all of our best practice configuration is now applied. Arguably, this platform is now business ready. Had I deployed using a CSV file across 10, 50, some other number of ADCs, all of those ADCs would now have a generic best practice configuration on them. This is the same style configuration. It's not exactly. Everybody might want tweaks from the base, but it's the same style configuration which I've deployed for around 8 years when I was with Citrix Professional Services. So if I connect to the ADC now, then the first thing you see, of course, is a warning message. And the warning message, because I used a self-signed management certificate. But if I connect and I go into look into settings, you can see that the default modes and features have all changed. All of the best practice settings, which I recommend within that article, again, that we linked earlier on, are now applied to the ADC. And once again, if I'd done this across a very wide environment, I would have best practices on absolutely everything, and I would now be ready to go ahead and deploy business services.
Okay, so I guess the thing there is it looks like a lot of work for a one HA pair, but we're kind of gearing it up because we're deploying across the world. Okay, so I think it moves on now. So we're now going to talk a bit about something called a stylebook, actually. So within ADM, there is this this construct. So it allows you to create application configuration from a YAML file. So it's an industry standard text file that you use to deploy application configuration to one or 100 different appliances. And I think the thing that I really like about Stylebooks is the fact that it gives you a way of deploying a configuration, and then once you've deployed it, you can revise it or give it to an app owner and say, here you go, here's your setup. And they don't, that's pretty much to your point, Stephen, they don't have to be experts on ADC. We can give them like a limited version of questions, cut down the ADC interface and just say, oh, these are the important things you're going to need to deploy your SharePoint web application or whatever it is. And Stephen's given a screenshot of a few Stylebooks. There's a load that are built into the appliance, and you can use these as templates to create your own. So it kind of is it's a really useful capability.
There's also some third-party Stylebooks that I should possibly mention. I mean, if you are going into my GitHub and looking in there for those configuration jobs that we just talked through, I've got a Stylebook, for example, in there which will deploy you a full gateway configuration, as in an on-premises gateway config on your ADC, which will connect to Citrix Cloud. Now, that's a huge number of deployments I've done in that style over the last 8 or so years in professional services. So if you were saying, hey, can I get somebody to come in and build me a best practice config with a gateway on my HA pair, there's a stylebook for that. 15 minutes, you've got your base config, and then you can import the stylebook, and you can do what we're about to demo to go and create a business service using that stylebook.
Okay, let me step it on so we see the movie.
So without further ado, how do stylebooks work? Let's go into applications and go and have a little look at our list of stylebooks. As Andrew said, there are a number of stylebooks which come by default, and as I was saying, there's quite a few third-party ones out there as well. A stylebook is a YAML definition of objects, and it's a definition of the objects that need to exist. ADM service is going to connect to the environment, examine that environment, and then is going to work out the configuration necessary to get to the end state defined in YAML. So this differs from the configuration jobs because it's not simply running a set of configuration commands. Instead, it's examining the environment now and working out how to get to that target state defined in the YAML stylebook. So I'm busy filling in settings here to create a fairly basic load balancer. I'm going to give it 2 backend servers. I'm just going to pick random backend servers for this, assign it to an ADC, and hit create. And you can see there that there's no ADC knowledge whatsoever required to do this. I needed to build a load balancer. I selected a load balancer. I told it what the servers and the ports were. It went off and configured the environment for me. I didn't need to know anything about ADC. And this, of course, is a fairly basic demonstration where we're building a load balancer. But as I said, I could have been building a gateway environment, and I could have had a content switch connecting to a gateway for unified gateway. I could have had some authentication rules to do multi-factor, and all of that could have been done for me using those definitions in YAML. And you can see here that exactly what I asked for within the stylebook has now been configured. And if this was a real service, this would be live and in production right now, and the business could use it. We've got a best practice config. We've got a best practice, if there is such a thing as a best practice load balancer, but we've got a load balancer built to a very high standard, the exact way Citrix would do it, because it's been done with a stylebook. And that, of course, could have been done by somebody with fairly little training who didn't have specialist knowledge in the ADC. We can come back in here, we can change any settings that we want to change, and then once we change those settings again, the ADM service will work out the resultant state necessary on the ADC and will issue the commands required to move the ADC into that state.
Okay. So I guess, as you said, it's not good just to read from the slides, but this is always the key question, isn't it? So once you've built this construct, this configuration pack, what does that give you? What does that give you over a config job? And I think this movie kind of walks it through. So you've got a new ADC that you've set up within your environment. So this 192.168.1.242 is another appliance that we're going to stick some configuration on. So it needs a bit of a base config. So you're going to put a subnet IP on that. So we've got that. And so it's effectively set up. I think now we're going to do, we could do with setting up the...
So we're on the default settings for this new appliance. It's just another blank appliance that I've imported into the environment. Let's go and add this new blank ADC into our ADM service environment. We'll put the IP address in there. It's on the exact same network as my other ADC, so of course I can reach it using the same agent. So I'll give it the same agent there, hit OK, and ADM service is going to reach out via the agent, connect to this new blank ADC, and then go ahead and import it.
I mean, obviously, it wouldn't have to be sitting next to it. It could be sitting anywhere on the internet. We just need an agent in that data center.
Absolutely. A common use case might be that you started off by building in a proof of concept environment, And then once you are happy that everything worked in your proof of concept environment, you might now be saying, well, great, I want to go and build this in production. And in production, we've deployed a new ADC. We are now going to take that new ADC. We're going to set an outbound SNP on it, which of course we did on the first one. We're going to create ourselves a management certificate. We've imported it into ADM, and we're going to go and apply all of those best practice configuration settings again. So let's repeat the exact same process. Go down, configuration jobs. We make a new configuration job. You note that this is a singular ADC. This is not an HA pair. So I'm going to have to make some alterations to those configuration commands that I imported. Specifically, I'm going to remove the line which sets some of the HA options in here because it's not in HA. So we'll just take those lines out. And once we've done that, we'll hit next on here. We're going to select our new ADC, which again could be an entirely different environment. Feed in all of the various settings in here so we can push out the best practice config again. This will just take a moment. I need to remember what that management certificate was called. Because again, you could be doing this in a totally different data center, totally different settings in here. And if it was a large number of devices, you could be importing this via CSV file. Once those settings are in, we get the resultant set of commands. We hit next in here. We could schedule the job, but I want to execute that job right now. The job will go off and execute. We will see returned on the screen once again that all of the commands have worked, or a summary of which commands have worked if some of them don't. In this scenario, of course, all the commands will work because otherwise it would make for a fairly poor demonstration. In progress, executing these commands. And there we go. All of the best practice settings are now on this ADC. We have another ADC, could have been an HA pair. I've only done one to do this quite rapidly. We have another ADC which has all of the best practice base config running on it. But you'll remember that we built a stylebook earlier on, and we applied the stylebook to what potentially could have been our proof of concept environment. And there is no load balancers on here, you'll see on the screen. If I flick back onto the stylebook that we previously created, there should be a configuration there. Scroll down, let's find the ADC that the stylebook was applied to. Let's change it from our proof of concept lab to our production ADC. And as soon as we OK this, let's just go and check what we're doing here so we can actually see some difference on the screen. You will see traffic management, load balancing virtual servers. You will see on our proof of concept environment that we have a load balancer. And if I now click OK on that stylebook and I move the load balancing stylebook from one ADC to the other, as if by magic, you will see that the load balancer disappears from our proof of concept environment and appears within our production environment. Now, of course, I'm doing this for a demo. Nobody would build a production environment without high availability, but it works nicely for a demo. So we've managed to move our stylebook from one environment to another, potentially from one data center to another. Let's go move it back again. We can open up that configuration job again. We can select the ADCs, and just as I did the first time, I'm going to go and deploy onto a different ADC. I can't imagine why you would want to deploy the same config onto multiple ADCs, but if you did have a use case for that, you could absolutely tick multiple ADCs. I suppose it's not that uncommon, actually, that people will have identical proof of concept and prod environments. But if that was the same, even to the tune of the IP addresses, you could do that. Normally, I would expect Stylebook to be applied to one environment. But you can see here, simply by changing the Stylebook configuration, the resultant set of commands is pushed out, and the entire environment is modified to match up to what's in the YAML, even if that means removing the configuration and applying it to an entirely different ADC. So, what have we seen? And coming to an end, we now have a little bit of recommended reading if you want to take this further. So the first item, of course, is the best practices for Citrix ADC deployments. That is the article which all of these settings were based on. We've then got the introduction to best practices for ADC for security. That's a wonderful article. There's quite a lot in there, as you would imagine, which overlaps with best practices. But whereas best practices focuses on a generic configuration, there's a lot more security recommendations for you to consider within that security article. Once you've built the environment and you've got these business services running, you probably have security requirements to comply with. Somebody will say it has to be TLS 1.2. It has to have these ciphers. How would you do that? Maybe people won't say that at all. People will say, what do other people do? What would be the recommendation here from somebody who was an expert in the art for a generic config? And that's what the networking SSL best practices are. It's an article covering what you would do in a generic implementation to apply security and TLS best practices. So there's an article for that. And it would be remiss not to finish with the huge number of excellent third-party documents which are available from Carl Stylebook's website.
Okay. Well, I think, so we talked today, so thanks very much, Stephen. So we talked today about we just covered the recommended reading. We've talked about the common challenges that we've seen in deployments and how to avoid them. Stephen's walked through the kind of deployment licensing, base config, then production service using a combination of ADM, agents, pool capacity, and some virtual appliance in our lab. But this all carries over to physical environments as well. They all run the same code base. And shown some of the benefits of Stylebooks. I mean, one of the things I really like about the Stylebook thing is the fact that you have an application configuration as part of a Stylebook setup. And then when you take that out, it actually removes the configuration. So one of those things you always get with ADCs is once they get configured, you never take configuration off. But that's very much something that you showed as part of that demo. And I think that is everything we've got to cover today. So unless Anna, is there any other questions on the questions tab?
We're good. I did want to make a quick announcement that for this session only, we're actually doing a giveaway. We'll be giving away an Oculus 2, which is an all-in-one virtual reality headset. So if you want to enter, all you have to do is complete the survey in the webinar console to be entered into the drawing. It's only for US and Canada residents. Terms and conditions apply, and the winner will be notified by email. We want to thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you guys next month.